I'd just like to inquire if there is anybody of you who have been watching on YouTube channel about Amazing Prophecies. Is there anybody here watching Amazing Prophecies by evangelist Mark Fox? Not either. He has a ministry, Forever Free Ministries, and he's based, I think, in Dallas. The reason why I called this, I mentioned this today, because last Sunday, when we were on our way to Arizona for the Pacific Union Conference constituency meeting, there was a text from him that there is somebody here in Apple Valley who would like to attend Sabbath here in our church, because he just has been watching this in YouTube channel and would desire to be baptized. And I wasn't able to call her or whoever it is because he did not mention the name, but he gave me his number, the evangelist, and hopefully I will be able to contact him, and of course the prospect who lives right here in Apple Valley. He said, we have a viewer that is interested in attending your church in Apple Valley. She desires, or she desires baptism and believes in the Sabbath also. So there's nobody here. I see some visitors, but I hope you are not one of them. So anyway, we will be able to contact her in a few days, so that we need to know her interest really from what she learned and what's over this YouTube channel. Well, there was a call at 10:30 p.m. 10:30 p.m. Someone had died. Would I please call the family? So before I could pick up the phone, the mother called me. Her son had taken drugs and had died that evening. So as I got dressed to go home, or to go that home, to that place, I wondered, what would I say? I was wondering, what would I say? So when I arrived, everyone right there at the house, they were milling around in a state of confusion. At length, the mother took me aside, and through her tears, she asked me the question I had known was coming. Do you know what was the question? She said, Pastor, why? Why did God let this happen to my son? It was not the first time that I have had no satisfactory answer to that question, and it won't be the last either. So when you look at the question of life and death, and when you consider the problem of this death sentence generation, you know that we are living in a death sentence generation. Even the most fervent believer, even the most fervent Christian looks up to the heavens and cries out, why? Why me? Why now? Why this? Or say, why? God, why? Why? You know, the question rings always across the centuries and through every generation. All of us may ask that question sooner or later. So if you haven't yet, okay, you will. You will, or I will. It's a question that does not admit of any answer. Indeed, you know, even the godliest believers have sometimes wondered. Even the godliest Christian, even they wondered about the ways of God. And here it is. And if Job, you know him in the Bible, and if Job never got a complete answer, what can I expect? What can we expect? So as I read the Bible, I don't think there is a single answer to that question. Why? Why? So all of us, as I said, will ask that question, why, sooner or later. Now we get one kind of answer in the book of Genesis, yes. Another answer in the book of Job, or maybe another answer in the book of Psalms, which maybe some of us is our favorite chapter or our favorite book. Or maybe we take another answer from the book of Ecclesiastes. And there, Ecclesiastes has another approach about this question. Or the gospel. The gospel is presenting to us about Christ, Jesus, whose very coming alters the way we think about everything. And finally, we go to the last book of the Bible, Revelation. And there it shows us our Lord's final victory and the final defeat of evil. Now, I don't mean to suggest that these various perspectives contradict each other, the books that I just mentioned. It's just that the problem of human suffering is so vast, so huge, that we need many different ways to think about it. And I'm sure you do that. That's where the book of Habakkuk is. I'd like to share this series or this study that I did in my other church leader at Warman, Finland. So let's go to the next slide. Does it work? Yeah, it's on. Oops. There. The book of Habakkuk. Now, Brother Ben was asking us, are you familiar with the book Habakkuk? Or is this your first time to hear about the book of Habakkuk? Habakkuk is there in the Bible. You know, it is squeezed in between Zephaniah, Nahum and Zephaniah. The book of Nahum and Zephaniah. Now, in this series, we are going to dig deep into this little book written just before the world caved in for the people of Judah. Habakkuk was one of those prophets in the country or in the nation of Judah. So, look for Habakkuk. He's one of the minor prophets of the Old Testament, or just look in the white pages of the Bible, of your Bible perhaps. Habakkuk is squeezed right there between Nahum and Zephaniah, and the two other books that I rarely read, Nahum and Zephaniah. Now let's back up for just a second. There are 17 prophetic books, 17 prophetic books in the Old Testament, not just Daniel or Ezekiel or Jeremiah. There are 17 of them divided between the major prophets and, of course, the minor prophets. The major prophets, there are Isaiah, Ezekiel, and you have Daniel. Of course, Jeremiah wrote 2 books, Jeremiah and Lamentations. That makes up 5. Now, Lamentations from the word lament, because those are the cries or the lamentations of Jeremiah. You know, he was considered a crying prophet. That's why he wrote these 2 books, Jeremiah and Lamentations. 5 major prophets. Then you have the minor prophets. 12 books of them, 12. They are not called major and minor because of their respective importance, but because of their size. The reason why they're called major, because the 5 major prophets have 191 pages. That's why it's called major, but the size of their books. But the minor prophets, only 61 pages. That's why they're called minor prophets. So, we're talking about the short books. And here's one of them, Habakkuk. Habakkuk has 56 verses and only 3 chapters. So if you dare to read Habakkuk, you can finish it in 3 or 5 minutes. 56 verses only and 3 chapters. Though he is a minor prophet, Habakkuk, there is nothing minor about his message. Nothing. He's writing about a topic that we all think about eventually. You know, Habakkuk is unlike the other prophetic books, major or minor. In that it records, a dialogue, a conversation between one man and a God. That's the essence of the whole book. It was a conversation of one man and God. Whereas Isaiah, if you notice, if you read the book of Isaiah, which has 66 chapters, Isaiah contains a message from God. Message from God to Isaiah. Habakkuk records a conversation with God. It was a one-on-one discussion or conversation with God. So, if ever you felt like you had a few questions for God, this is the book for you, Habakkuk. One seminary professor, in fact, gave us this comment right here. The man with a question mark for a brain. The man with a question mark for a brain. Now, here's a bit of background. It was the year 605 BC. That's before Christ. 605 BC or thereabouts. We cannot be sure of the precise year that this happened. But, after good King Josiah, remember that little boy king, Josiah? He was a very good king until he became an adult. After that good King Josiah died in 609 BC, the nation of Judah plunged headlong back into the cesspool of corruption, immorality, and idolatry. And it has plagued for many generations in that nation alone, Judah. This time the people seemed hell-bent on their own destruction. Instead of just edging toward the cliff, they seemed determined to plunge over into the cliff, full speed. It was as if the nation had a death wish and no use for God at all. Now, about the man Habakkuk. Habakkuk, we know almost nothing. We know almost nothing about him. We assume that he was around, say, 30 years old, but that's just a good guess. We know he was a contemporary of Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and would have been 10 to 15 years older than Daniel. Now, when we saw the terrible moral decline of Judah, he prayed to God. And you know what was his prayer? He says, do something. God, do something. My country is in total collapse. It's in turmoil. Immorality, you have this idolatry, all this corruption. Do something. Now, in his mind, he no doubt thought that God would raise up another good king to lead the people of Judah into the right direction. Little did he know that God's answer to his prayer would come by way of the hated Babylonians. He did not expect that kind of answer. The hated Babylonians? Wow! So, as I consider behind the book, I am reminded of the famous words of Billy Graham. Maybe you have heard about him. Billy Graham uttered when he was a young preacher this quote: if God doesn't judge America, he's going to have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. That's a pretty good statement, right? You know what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. Those two cities in the plains were so wicked, corrupt, immoral, that God destroyed them. Remember the story of Lot. So Billy Graham mentioned this: if God doesn't judge America, you know our situation these days now in this great country, he's going to have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. If those words were true 67 years ago, how much truer must they be today? These words. Habakkuk lived in confusing times. We live in confusing times. Did you notice that? Yes, just like Habakkuk, so do we today. That's why we're calling this series. It will not be a consecutive Sabbath because I only come here once a month. That's on the third Sabbath. But I call this as the Strong Faith for Confusing Times series. Strong faith for confusing times. Yes, we may be in these confusing times, but we've got to have strong faith, friends. We've got to have strong faith. We need to sit with Habakkuk for a while so we can find faith strong enough for our own troubling times. You know, Habakkuk wrote out this argument with God in 3 short chapters. Habakkuk argued with God, and you will find this argument right there in the 3 chapters, only 3 chapters of the book. And here's a simple outline of this argument that Habakkuk, I'd like to share this with you. You know, in chapter 1, there is this argument about testing of his faith, or faith tested. And then in chapter 2, it says there, his faith is what? Taught. His faith is taught. Then number 3, or chapter 3, there is the outline of faith triumphant. Faith triumphant. So these are the 3 outlines of, Habakkuk. If you try to really dig so deep into these 3 chapters. Now, we can describe Habakkuk's personal journey this way. Look at this same, almost the same slide. His personal journey was like this. Chapter 1, there is this argument. Chapter 2, there is this answer of the argument. And in chapter 3, there is this acceptance of the argument. That's how Habakkuk, journeyed in his relationship with God. Remember, he was not receiving a message from God to him and to the people. He was one-on-one with God. He was one-on-one with God. Now, remember, friends, Habakkuk is a very modern book. It is a very modern book. And here is what the prophet is doing in his chapter. In chapter 1, Habakkuk is asking. Habakkuk is asking God. In chapter 2, Habakkuk is waiting God to answer what he asked in chapter 1. And then in chapter 3, you have there the what? The praying. The praying. So along the way, Habakkuk experiences is a total change. It is a total change. Because in this book, you will notice that he moves from fear to faith. And then from fear to faith, he moves from burden to blessing. And then from perplexity to praise. And then from confusion to confidence. And then the last part of his journey is about worry to worship. Worry, confusion to confidence, and worry to worship. There was one pastor who mentioned or who said that Habakkuk begins with a question mark and ends with an exclamation point. And we will deal with that in the next 2 Sabbaths. Habakkuk begins with a question mark. And the story or experience of this great guy ends with an exclamation point. Now, in many ways, this is a very modern book, in that it raises the question that we sometimes wrestle today. We wrestle today about just like Habakkuk. Now, there was a young man troubled by many problems. He was troubled by many problems. Now, after describing his particular issues or problems, he framed the question this way, this young man. He said, I am exhausted with life, and I would like to kill myself if it weren't for the fact that I am a coward as hell. And I don't have the guts to carry it out. I see therapists, I see psychiatrists, but they don't help. They just stuff me with drugs and send me on my way home. Why is God silent? He asked. Why is God silent? Why does he not act? And where is he? According to this young man, where is he? Brothers and sisters, we've all been there. I'm sure of that. We have all been there, even if we wouldn't put it exactly that way. When up against problems for which there is no human solution, we look to heaven and cry, why don't you do something about it? I mean, God, why don't you do something about it? So, as we open the book of Habakkuk, Habakkuk is confused. Habakkuk is agitated. So there are three issues that haunt Habakkuk. Three issues. The first issue is unanswered prayer. Have you experienced that you pray to God many times and still there is no answer? Habakkuk did that, had that. Unanswered, that was the first issue. Unanswered prayer. That's why he says in Habakkuk 1 verse 2 from the New Living Testament, how long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Did you try attempting to tell God that? Lord, you're not listening. Pay attention. I'm in so much trouble. How long must I call for help, but you do not listen? Violence is everywhere, meaning in Judah, violence is everywhere. I cry, but you do not come to save. Very interesting verse. Consider the things going on in the world today. You have heard through your TV right there, or maybe in the internet, you have warfare. You have murder. You have corruption in high places. You have sexual perversion. You have looting, robbery, and still many kinds of perversity in this world, especially in this country that we're living today. Now, those same things were happening in Habakkuk's day, friends. They happened in Habakkuk's day. So as Habakkuk surveys the evil that he saw on every hand, he cried out to God, how can you let this go on, O God? How can you let this go on? Sooner or later, we all wonder about God's seeming inactivity. Where is God when we need Him? Just like to mention some examples this morning, a godly mother prays for her wayward son. This wayward son was raised in the church. He went to Sabbath school. He knows the Bible. But when he left home, he left everything all behind. And for many, many years, his mother has prayed for him. But to this day, he remains a prodigal son. Another example, a wife prays for her husband, who left her after 23 years of marriage for a younger woman. He seems utterly unreachable, and the marriage just heads swiftly for a divorce. Another example, a husband prays for his wife, who has a terminal cancer. She has 6, maybe 7 months to live, and none of the treatments stop the rampaging tumors. The elders, anoint her with oil and pray over her in the name of the Lord. After that, she dies 5 months later. Another example, a young man prays fervently for deliverance from an overpowering temptation. But the struggle never seems to end. The more he prays, the worse the temptation becomes. And so, we cry out. We cry out with the psalmist. Remember what David says in Psalm 10 verse 1 in the English Standard Version? Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? These things are all in the Bible, just like, our experiences today. Where are you? You seem far away. Why are you hiding yourself during these times of trouble? Have you heard of those girls in Nigeria? That was many years ago. You know what happened to them? It was April 2014, 7 years ago to be exact. 276 Nigerian schoolgirls were kidnapped by the Muslim terrorist organization Boko Haram. Remember that terrorist organization Boko Haram? 276 Nigerian schoolgirls. Most of the girls were Christians. Of course, there were a few that were Muslims. What was their crime? They just wanted an education. something the radical Muslims don't want to their women. For a while we saw the hashtag bring back our girls. And for a while we got concerned. The world got concerned of those 276 Nigerian schoolgirls. So far, only 57 of the kidnapped girls have escaped. And no one knows what has happened to the rest. But some have been sold as child brides or forced into sex slavery. Their kidnappers have released videos boasting of what they did. So we are entitled to ask. You are entitled to ask, Lord, where are you? Why do you not do something about this? Why? The next issue that haunted Habakkuk is this: uncontrolled perversity. There was perversity all around, and it was uncontrolled. So much perversity during the time. That's why he says, why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore, the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. Imagine that. When lawlessness prevails, friends, brothers and sisters, no one is safe. Remember last July weekend, 4th of July weekend in Chicago? Over 100 people were shot and 19 were killed. And among the wounded were 13 children and 2 Chicago police officers. But it wasn't just Chicago that has problems. Perhaps you've read this headline in USA Today: Police Chief, Rabbi among 71 nabbed in child pornography bust. You know that? The dark web. The expansion of the dark web. Very disturbing, especially among our young people. And we as parents or adults here, if you have young people, make sure that they don't go to this particular app or place in the internet. What is the dark web? It is expanding where pedophiles hide using websites that encrypt their computers identifying information. It has fueled, an explosion of child pornography. The dark web refers to the vast underground internet. It is also like, it's an internet, but it's underground. That cannot be accessed through search engines like Google. The dark web is said to be many times larger than the internet most of us know and we use every day. Pornographers, drug traffickers, violent criminals, the terrorists of every variety use this dark web to hide their evil deeds. And in this case, the police were able to crack the case because they were able to penetrate part of the dark web. Technology is good, just like we have today. Technology is good when it is used for good purposes. And I noticed Dr. Jack is doing some kind of technology already here. It is good for good purposes, but when you put in the hands of evil people, technology unleashes uncontrolled perversity in the world. The third thing that haunted Habakkuk is unexpected answer. Here it is, that this makes the story really heavier. The plot of the story thicken. Habakkuk faces this third issue when God gives him an answer that he doesn't expect. He didn't expect that answer, but that was an answer anyway. And here, look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed. This is God telling Habakkuk, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. What was this answer all about? Taken by itself, those words might lead Habakkuk to think that God is going to send a mighty spiritual awakening to Judah. In other words, there will be a revival that will rid the nation of idolatry and bring them back to God. Sometimes, preachers use this verse as a basis for praying for revival, reformation in our day. While I certainly, of course, think we ought to pray for revival, all right, that's not what this verse is all about. God is going to send something, but it is not a revival. No. What did he say? I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the earth. Wow. He was expecting for a revival, something that will transform Judah. But here, Habakkuk did not expect such. In other words, God was about to send judgment to Judah. By what? By the hated Babylonians. Now, nothing that God said could have surprised Habakkuk more than this. He knew about the Babylonians. Habakkuk knew about these hated people. Everybody knew the Babylonians. Remember, they were the most hated, they were the most feared nation on earth under the leadership of King Nebuchadnezzar. Their armies plundered the nations around them. No one could stand against them. No one could defeat them. They were vicious. They were rapacious. And in their appetite for destruction, they just wanted to take, every city. They just took every city. They wanted a province, they took a province. And if they wanted a nation, they took that nation. They were the rulers of the world that time. Now, it is hard for us to fully understand how the Jews felt about the Babylonians. They swept across the ancient Near East with a cruelty that was unknown. If a conquered city was considered insufficiently servile, according to this story, they will put a pile of skulls in the city plaza as a warning not to rebel against them. They poked out eyes of conquered kings. Remember King Zedekiah? They poked eyes out of conquered kings and marched these kings or rulers off in chains, sometimes with hooks through their jaws. Right there. And these people are nasty people, and God knows how bad they are. And look at how God describes them in the next few verses. Just like that verse, it says, whose strength is their God. Yes, they were just ruthless and impetuous, feared and dreaded. They were law to themselves. Themselves is their law. They are swift as leopards, ravenous as wolves, and they swoop on their prey like eagles, dropping from the sky. That's in verse 8. And then in verse 9, they gather prisoners like sand. And in verse 10, they mock kings. In verse 10, they laugh at fortified cities. And then verse 11, it says, they never stop. And here is God's ultimate indictment of them, whose strength is their God. Friends, the point is, there are nasty people, and God knows how bad they are. It's not like He's raising up the little sisters of the poor, to judge Judah. He's not calling on the Boy Scouts to do the job. No, when God decides to judge Judah, He picks the meanest nation on the block to do the job for Him. Sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. Sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. Nothing about that made sense to Habakkuk. Of course, to us, nothing made sense. Why is God telling us that Babylon will be the one to conquer them? It is as if God said, I'm going to raise up Al-Qaeda to judge America because you did not respect my law. You will now live under Sharia law. Just like that. So as shocking as that sounds, that's exactly how God's message sounded to Habakkuk. He couldn't believe what he just heard from God. Remember this lady? You're familiar with the story of Miriam Ibrahim. She was a 27-year-old medical doctor in Sudan. She was arrested, tried, convicted of apostasy and adultery. Her crime? supposedly converting from Islam when in fact she had been raised as a Christian. She wasn't an apostate because you cannot live a religion you never joined in the first place. They accused her of adultery because she had a child with her husband, who is a Christian from Sudan who immigrated to the United States. That is the adultery that was really a charge because of that intimate relationship with their own husband and because they didn't recognize her marriage to a Christian. Sentenced to death by hanging for apostasy and sentenced also to 100 lashes for adultery, she was given a chance on the stand to recant her Christian faith. She was given that. We will set you free if you just recant your Christian faith. Time and time again, the prosecutor badgered her to announce or renounce Jesus. But she refused each time. And finally she said, I am a Christian and I will remain a Christian. I am a Christian and I will remain a Christian. So as a result of her faithful witness, she was not only kept in jail, but she was put in shackles. In fact, the authorities would not even unchain her when she gave birth in prison. And through it all, she steadfastly refused to renounce the name of Christ. And after millions of people throughout the world protested, she was recently allowed to leave Sudan with her husband and 2 children who are now in the United States of America. You can see through Google the story of Miriam Ibrahim arrives in Hewitt. So we're doing fine without God, or so we think. What if God allows this for a purpose? What? What if these things must happen? You know, very often things had to get worse before they could get better. We are in the midst of pandemic. When are we going to get better? I hear many people say that we need a revival in America. I certainly agree with that. I also hear some people say that we are on the brink of a great movement back to God. And I don't know if that is true or not, but I certainly hope it is. But we can pray and we can work so that the time will come when all of this will just be done. So why have we as a nation turned away from the truth? Why? Why the collapsing moral standards right here in this great country? Why have we so quickly accepted about these things about marriage? That is not right. I think the answer is clear. As a nation, we don't need God. We're doing fine without Him, or so we think. I remember how on the Sunday after 9/11, that was almost 20 years ago. The Sunday after 9/11, you know what happened, right? We're about to celebrate the 20th anniversary of 9/11. But the Sunday after 9/11, churches were what? Were crowded with people. Millions of Americans responded to the terrorist attack by coming to a house of worship. But soon the post-crisis attendance bump disappeared. After a few weeks, things returned more or less to normal. And we said to ourselves, things will never be the same again. But we were wrong. Friends, I can tell you what happened in America after 9/11. We turned toward God, but we didn't turn to Him. We turned toward God, but we didn't turn to Him. There's a big difference. We turned in His direction, yes, but we did not repent of our national sins. Because turning toward God is good, but it will never last. Only turning to God can change a nation. We need a big God. We need a big God. That's why I said I call this series A Strong Faith for Confusing Times. So let's try to wrap up things with these 3 important insights. First, we have to see only a part of the picture. We see only a part of the picture. When it comes to understanding what God is doing in the world, we are like ants. We are like ants on a Rembrandt. We crawl and crawl across the dark brown and think all of life is colored dark brown, just like ants, okay? Then we hit green and think, oh, this is better. Now all is green. But soon comes the dark blue, okay? Dark blue, and then there is the splash of yellow, and then there's a streak of red, and then another patch of brown. On we journey from one color to another, never realizing that God is actually painting a masterpiece in our lives to another, never realizing that God is actually painting this in our lives in order that we will have a beautiful palette of color. Now one day we will discover that every color had its place. Every color had a reason. Nothing was wasted or out of place, just as there is a time and a season for everything, because there is also a color for every stage of life's journey. When the painting is finished, we will discover that we were part of his masterpiece from the very beginning. What's the next one? God isn't limited to what we think he ought to do. He's not limited. What you're thinking may not be what he's thinking. We continually make the mistake of thinking that our plans and God's plans are the same. No, they aren't. Some wise person said it this way: write your plans in a pencil and give God the eraser. Write your plans in the pencil. Write your plans in pencil and give God the eraser. If your God always does what you want, he's probably not the God of the Bible. Here's another way to say it. If your God always does what you want, he's probably not the God of the Bible, because God will be no man's servant. He's God. He does whatever he pleases. And the last part is this: we need a bigger God. We need a bigger God. Habakkuk got his mind messed up because he knew what God should do. In fact, chapter 1 of Habakkuk shows us that he was wrong twice. First, when he thought God was ignoring Judah's sin. And the second mistake was he couldn't believe that God would use the Babylonians to judge his own people. He couldn't believe that. Friends, we need a bigger God who is bigger than our puny ideas. We need a God whose ways continually surprise us. How big is your God? How big is your God? Friends, brothers and sisters, here is what Ellen White is telling us. The faith that strengthened Habakkuk and all the holy and the just in those days of deep trial was the same faith that sustained God's people today. In the darkest hours, under circumstances the most forbidding, the Christian believer may keep his soul stayed upon the source of all light and power. Day by day, through faith in God, his hope and courage may be renewed. The just shall live by his faith. In the service of God, there need to be no despondency, no wavering, no fear. The Lord will more than fulfill the highest expectation of those who put their trust in him. He will give them the wisdom their very necessities demand, because he is our God and we are his people. My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither your ways are my ways, is God Jehovah. Because as I am higher than the heavens, so are my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. May the Lord bless us. This is my prayer.